Hi everybody, thank you Hannah. Like she said, my name is Makena, and I'm excited today to present this project to you. It's called the SHADOWLANDS Testing Ground, and it's located in the Las Vegas Valley. But before I take you there, I need to take you to where it all began, which is the Las Vegas Strip. So Vegas is somewhere that conjures up all sorts of associations. Maybe you think of it as Sin City, or the Glitter Gulch, or the City of Lost Wages. But I wanted to understand what is exactly going on with the built form to construct such an iconic image. Put simply, the Vegas Strip is essentially a stretch of marketing fragments. Thematic signage meets casino, where it's very hard to determine which structures are advertising and which are city. The first official architectural study done on the Strip was a text called Learning from Las Vegas. It came out of a 1972 Yale studio, and they took on the task of sorting through the chaos of this spontaneously unplanned city. They concluded that the ephemeral thematic objects that serve to market the casinos, these strange, flashy billboards, the rise and fall of these symbols have a greater presence and spatial impact within the urban morphology than the actual buildings or even the surrounding desert landscape. What that leaves, from an analysis standpoint, is a city that's not well read if you try to understand it through its 3D grid, like you would with most other urban analyses. The passing signs as one moves down the Strip are also not exactly 2D either when you consider their monumentous spatial presence. Even this tourist map sort of indicates that there's an in-between 2.5D spatial dimension occupying the Las Vegas Strip. But the most curious part about this idea, that the marketing objects are more important to the story of Las Vegas than any other constructed element, is the truth that these objects are built for obsolescence. Some of the oldest, most quote-unquote iconic monuments are about 30 years old and surely will be gone when the casinos next change ownership. The entire ecosystem of the Las Vegas Strip hinges on the changing of thematics to keep things fresh and patrons coming through the doors of the casinos, meaning signs and monuments are erected, replaced with slightly different versions as the casinos rise and fall with new ownerships, or the same casino even is rebranded. Because of this, there's a growing archive of these monuments as heritage objects. So this is the context for the built form in Las Vegas, according to Learning from Las Vegas. But something this perspective overlooks is the fact that the city is in, obviously, the Mojave Desert. It's a hot climate and it's getting hotter. And from the perspective of a landscape designer looking to site a project, the truth is this is really not a region you should be spending extended time outside without access to some sort of major cooling resource, mainly an air-conditioned vehicle. Because of this, recreational time spent outside is spent in close proximity to a car and mainly during the morning and evening, certainly not during the heat of summer. Now to flip back to the Learning from Las Vegas reading of this place and take a look at the overnight rise of the metropolis now with the beating sun in mind, we see that an unintended consequence of all of this 2.5D marketing materials are the massive shadows cast by temporary monuments. The near constant sun, 210 days yearly, mean large shadows are a permanent feature of an ephemeral city. A city that would otherwise be void of any natural shadow casting elements. Because of this, shadows, and therefore comfort, are both linked to the marketing lifespan of these collective monuments. In this flat desert valley where shade is otherwise scarce, an object's shadow becomes an extension of the form casting it. It doesn't matter if the thing itself has little architectural value, like a billboard. The precious shade gives it value. And suddenly, the weight of a shadow extending from a 2D object has a greater tectonic presence than the object itself. So maybe this is the 2D or the third dimension in a 2D city. Knowing all this, we now need to step out and figure out what it is that people actually do for fun outside in this place, and if a pleasure landscape in the desert is even possible. So what I found is that the wilderness of the Mojave Desert is a destination resource to nature, just sort of like the forests are to us in Oslo. So there's this place called the Jean Lake Playa that's 20 minutes south of the city that has a unique appeal for this reason. And the reason I could even discover this place as someone who has no real connection to Las Vegas is through aerial and ground imagery that reveals how this specific stretch of desert is really not barren at all. It's covered with the traces of its anthropogenic usage, only at this really extremely fine resolution. This is interesting to me because it's the opposite effect of the colossal monuments just 20 minutes north. This site is a dried up lake bed, meaning it hosts almost no vegetation. And the story of its use and appeal can be read through aerial photography, capturing various traces of recreation. And this is a way of reading site that's really unique to the desert, because the happenings in an unvegetated landscape are so exposed to the aerial eye. Satellite imagery is able to reveal so much more of what is occurring at ground level in the desert compared to, for example, forest. These traces are made, wiped away, and left over the years. So what these images tell me is that I've stumbled upon the Wild West. In a moment, I'm going to zoom in on some of these so we can see a little bit better how people behave in the Wild West. But first, through these images that bear so much activity at a ground level, I'm reminded of the Nevada test site, which is actually not far upstate. This is where military testing is hosted. Anthropogenic activity is imprinted on the ground, in this case at a very large scale. Back to Jean. Upon this dry lake bed, I see that people are dirt biking, ATVing, and this is evidenced through thin double or single tracked lines on the desert surface. Every movement left on this plane leaves an extremely visible trace. Through black and white image making, you can draw out this activity. By viewing these micro shadows, you get a sense of the complex patterns happening in low relief at the surface. I found people come here in RVs to camp or drive around in donuts, and you can see every single bit of that motion when you look close. People come and they fly in their hot air balloons. I think that says a lot about the perceived freedom-scape of the American Wild West. And then people also fly their planes, which traces out calligraphy of another kind. Lastly, and quite interestingly, this place is a cultural hub. Rituals such as weddings, biennales, and festivals all take place here during different periods of the day and year. A calligraphy of traces illustrate a palimpsest of pleasure use. And because the desert hosts nothing permanently, it becomes the stage for everything. This next part of the project I'm going to take you through is called the catalog. This has been my main research method in form finding. Being fascinated by the power of shadows cast by urban objects, I realized that the novelty of being in the shade is the greatest organizer of space in a place that has none. And to repurpose a growing archive of junked objects that I know exist in Las Vegas, I realized I could conduct a sort of cultural experiment in a place that has such a precedent for desert testing. So, to begin, I became an expert of the billboard shadow. I created a catalog of the marketing objects around Las Vegas that are very likely to become obsolete soon. Using the solar seasons, the solstices, equinoxes, and periods 6 weeks before and after, I found the solar footprint for what these shadows would do if they could literally trace imprints in the sand like all these other desert activities. With these 5 wingspans as my palette as a designer and shadow as my partner, I took authorship over these topographies, created through a software that reads grayscale images as elevations, making as many tests as I could, emphasizing certain times of day and year over others. Using this technique, the shadows and I could draw unlimited permutations, marking the furthest boundaries of a single object's shadow on the ground surface. So you see how a simple 2.5D billboard has a footprint in aerial view so much larger than what you would see from a typical orthographic plan drawing. I was curious what kind of environment a collection of these generic objects could produce, if now acknowledging this third shadow dimension. So I became very well acquainted with this technique of drawing topographies that reveal shadows, experimented formally and logically. After testing these 5 seasons, I thought, okay, what if only the solstices were revealed? Or maybe the whole year, but just the second half of the day. Or maybe the evenings, as well as the whole day in June. Or maybe sunsets, or maybe a mixture. Throughout this process, I exhausted all of the combinations of times and day of year that had any real logic to me, and began pairing diverse times of day and season to create forms that are eclipsed by shade sporadically, in really a formal design exercise. So the forms of these objects, and thus their shadows, became my parameter. This book then became a critical mass of experiments. This is something you can flip through when the diploma is published. So after the catalog came the composition log. Next, I wanted to bring these objects to a shared site to see how the shadow prints might relate to each other while revealing disjunct times of day and year. I tested the effects of this in a composition by adding a second common layer of shadows to the now altered terrain, and created a grouping of forms with many times represented. I repeated this process with 5 other compositions to create a series to see how separate forms turn into a spatial layout when linked through consistent shadow. This being my research thread, I can now take you to the project, which is the Shadowlands testing ground at Jean Lake Drybed. When you look at the site plan, you can interpret it as a zoning for the various figures, as well as a concrete proposal for a site that will be redesigned and reorganized over time as objects are brought in and new forms can be tested to suit dynamic use. 3 distinct zones, for example, are the 3 vault spaces intended for storing archival objects before they are taken into the main testing ground. Organized by size of shadows, the grids, presumably, will attract different uses. In each of them, there will be unattended motorized vehicles, or drones, that automate the task of 3D scanning and painting these objects. The purpose of the paint is to strip the forms of half of their symbolism through color and emphasize their silhouette, compatible, of course, with their shadow. The vaults host objects by size range. This medium vault, for example, hosts objects from 2 to 20 meters tall, and it'll be spaced 25 to 50 meters apart. So next I mentioned 3D scanning of the objects. So this is because in another corner of the site, the Garden of Shrunken Shadows is dedicated to the exhibition of 1 meter tall 3D printed replicas of these objects, where a testing of the forms at model scale can occur before the real objects are taken into the main testing area. So what this does is create a visible reference for what is happening on the rest of the site by allowing you to better see the full parameter of the forms at eye level. It's also an opportunity to dig more dramatic elevations in relation to the smaller object. I can imagine all sorts of groups coming in and testing out simple dugout or raised forms before they are created at full scale. The next part of this plan is the main testing ground, where the full-size objects are brought in. The testing ground links the movement of desert traces over time with the rise and fall of the casino monuments on the strip. So as monuments collect on site, individual compositions can be reconstructed and reinterpreted to accommodate new forms that highlight different times of day and year. The intention is for the excavations to be shallow enough to suit the extremely flat site while still being perceived at ground level. I imagine people coming in to visit throughout the year and for these spaces to be continually changed like exhibitions. Not only are the forms intended to physically be reconstructed to inspire new uses over time, the same form is actually enlivened differently throughout the day and season as the sun changes the location where people gather. One such gathering might be in a form oriented toward a summer evening, appropriated as a venue for a music festival or a wedding reception. The idea is that the diversity of forms allows for many activities to occur at once and over time across the large expanse of space. And these new ways of interpreting the plane are created simply by excavating and moving the loamy site matter through cut and fill gestures. Since permanence has been a key theme of this project, it was important to me that these forms not be treated as a land artwork that needs to be pristinely maintained. Rather, I think it's much more interesting for the construction of the forms to be part of the experiment itself, as they are left to weather, stain, and invite new ecological scenarios within their microclimates. I can imagine the coolest, most sheltered parts of the surface area will create an opportunity for vegetation to spontaneously grow. Low points will also hold on to water after a heavy storm. As compositions and objects are reshuffled, traces of the previous activity will likely stain onto the earth and linger on. I have drawn a few scenarios of how I think these topographies might be enlivened during different seasons. This form, specifically, highlights the 5 p.m. sun at all times of the year. And I have an idea that people who go spring camping after work will now set up their tents and RVs in the shadow between berms like these ones. But then maybe for certain sporting events such as ATV or motorcycle racing, it's not so imperative to be under the shade necessarily, but it's still important that you arrive early enough in the day that it's not too hot out, so drivers actually may use the morning shadows in the vault as parallel racing lanes. I could also imagine some kind of wellness retreat appropriating one of the morning depressions for an exercise class. In all, these spaces are only prescriptive of the activity they host through the time of day during which they are meant to be enlivened. So, as the last thread before I begin my conclusion, I'll say, if the shadows are the primary designer of this experiment, entropy is the second. As these forms are used, they are also being destroyed. Like shadows on the strip, the shallow topography created by vehicle tracks are a consistent measure within a field of apparent chaos. So to end, Las Vegas is a city of patterns, not precise components, where marketing monuments rise and fall in a choreography of capitalism and spectacle. Amid this entropy, monstrous shadows from 2D signage draw their own patterns in the landscape, and temporary forms are made permanent through shadow. A landscape architectural reading of this context seeks to clarify this pattern without sanitizing it. By using the movement of a shadow to trace a series of temporary topographies, Gene Lake morphs into a testing ground in afterlife for these marketing objects. The thesis hypothesizes that the accumulation of shadow imprints on an otherwise flat desert plain is enough to highlight and repurpose the shade generated by obsolete artifacts. This shadowland then becomes a social experiment in structuring the anarchy of human activity in the American Wild West.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Very beautiful, very clear project, I think. You're presenting it in a map at the end, very clear layout of the grids in these ML and XL object vaults, like from the view top down, very clear what's happening there. But I think there's actually another project happening here as well. I think in landscape architecture, one of the biggest issues we're having is that we are working against these like dynamic ephemeral systems that we somehow try to frame through maybe mapping or plans or sections, etc. And maybe using like methods of remote sensing, like Earth imaging. Maybe satellites are looking down from space, etc. And they're showing us the grounds of the Earth, maybe like every few days, or maybe you're going with a camera, you take a picture, and it's exactly there. And you're pointing to this like ephemeral state of the shadows somehow, that's like always changing throughout the day and like in different seasons of the year as well. And you're developing these techniques to like work back against that in order to figure out like how can we shape the environment through them. And you are using some techniques that are actually very usual to remote sensing, very similar to like a multi-temporal image, for example, where you choose these like 3 different lightings that you have there. I think, what did you say, pink and gold and green, I think. You do something very similar in remote sensing, where you take 3 different kinds of states shot at 3 moments in time, you put them in the red, green, and blue channel of a composite image. So there's something about like sensing here that provides for the projects. It's not only like a map, and you not only place them somewhere, but you really want to work with this ephemeral state of the shadow. And I think you're transporting this very well in the project. Also in the way that you're building up the topography through this engagement with these different states of the shadows. And can we have another look at this like main overview map that you had before? So I think, in this image somehow everything is merged for me. I don't know which kind of like states we're seeing here. And that's like the kind of like playfulness that you're having with the project. I feel you've got a very specific moment in time, and that's the shadows that are exactly visible here. But then there's this like underground layer, and we don't know exactly what's happening. We're seeing these like little circles from like vehicles before, or from people having some kind of activities there, and they're all merged into this like very complex images of shadows that you have here. And I think they're very useful for you to provide for the project. And it's very easy to envision that people are using these spaces and that they're using the extensions of the shadows to move maybe throughout the day, and that there can be spontaneous vegetation occurring in some of these spaces. I think in the booklet you were starting with a song and you were ending with a song. So I was actually thinking before the end of the booklet, like now she's doing like a timetable for a festival or something. It's going to be a big party, that there was like music reverberating through the space somehow. It was like a very lively project, I thought, also on that. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation and for your very dense research work. I believe that you propose to work in a circumstance, this Jean Lake place, which seems to be a non-place, a place without any kind of references, but going more deeply in your observation, you start finding patterns, probably random patterns, but then you start putting this hypothesis of working with a shadow and working with the shadow, and you did a very systematic observation about what could be the effects of the shadow in the ground. And if, by hypothesis, you place those elements that you choose among the Las Vegas landscape to be placed here within a certain set of rules, either geometric, either apparently randomic, as we have in the center, you start finding in situ what could be a fixed pattern. And I must say that to fix the place of a certain object is not a random act, is normally an act of will. Thinking about Neolithic landscapes, many of the megalithic structures that are constructions were placed always in very specific situations, very specific circumstances, not only to be observed, but also to create an effect of centralness. I've been working in megalithic landscapes recently, and I was doing the same kind of analysis about the relation between elements, space, geometry of the land, and mostly the cosmogonic effect of the movement or the apparent movement of the sun, for example. And together with archaeologists, we start doing a kind of observation about what is the effect of the placement of very different kind of objects in a landscape with a specific morphology. So what I think I'm doing a kind of parallel exercise with your project is to understand this as a kind of archaeology of the non-existing place. So by speculating, as you are doing, the positions of these elements, you obtain patterns. And this is a kind of parameterized research method which you start showing that could produce space and a strong effect in space. By doing this kind of micro-modulations, you also said that this could be an opportunity to create, let's say, biotopes, but also not only about plants and animals that would for sure use this differentiation in this concavic lake, dry lake. We could start imagining, as you proposed, that this would create a dynamic in space. And this dynamic has to do with, let's say, the habitat conditions in a desert like this, with such extreme conditions of life, of course, creating this shadowland, this land of shadows, always in movement, but always returning to the same point in a cycle, a one-year cycle, would generate, let's say, a site, would transform a kind of non-place into a place. And that's a very interesting approach. So between this kind of archaeology of the future, I think your project make me think and could make everyone think about how to deal with these conditions, departing from a very abstract circumstance into a very concrete situation. Thank
you. Congratulations. It's a fantastic project. And I would like to go deeply in some concept. The first one is, could be a question, but it could be also a complicated question. There is part of tradition that think that we are now in a post-critical moment in which we are changing all the critical categories. In a way, you are changing memory with souvenir, identity with kitsch, and morphology with billboards. So that is a rhetorical figure that we call synecdoche, to use a part of something to generate a new meaning that consider the world. It's not a negative critics, it's a possibility of criticism and history, of criticism and theories, to think to this kind of new vocabulary, souvenir and kitsch in your case. Girdorfer has written in the 90s a book about the kitsch as new critical categories for contemporary, because we are breaking now all the typical categories of modernity. So memory is not anymore a category. So you have to start to play with this kind of leftover of the last century to reimagine new space, and you have done it. And I think it's important also to nominate this uncomfortable noun, because to say that I'm doing a project using souvenir, it's not weak. Apparently it's weak, but it's not so weak. So maybe to clarify these everyday objects, as in Paris with the Dadaism, so that you can transform in something new. So you are in this post-critical idea of design that is totally different from a common idea of landscape, because landscape, and we saw it also in the past projects, as to solve something that is very phenomenological, not narrative, as in your case, that cannot be reduced to a narration. So the problem of climate is part of this philosophy of irreductionism. So how you can put something that is narrative and post-critical in this frame of irreductionism, that is a question of climate. And you work it very well, using the shadow. So you avoided, it's quite important to solve the question of climate using nature. So nature is a problem and nature is a solution. In the common project on landscape, you say, no, plastic is a solution. That is a paradox, because it's the element that we want to fight for generate spaces with for related to climate. So it's quite important, because of you are trying to join two different philosophical categories and two different logics with a new plan of meaning, and you solve it very well. So you are within this plastic landscape. A plastic garden is the right definition, because it's a garden, it's not really a landscape, it's a garden. You play also with sensation and movement, these categories of a new idea of garden. And in a moment you change the narration, so you start to use the keywords that Robert Smithson used in Passaic, the same keywords. The entropy, the postcard, this place that has no future but comes from a future, the same. If you have in mind the text, the beautiful text that Smithson published on Passaic in 69, I think, he spoke about a place without future, the entropy as solution, and the postcard from a future that doesn't exist. So it's very similar to this kind of vocabulary that is not easy to reconduct to a post-critical moment, but it's maybe, I don't know if I would use entropy, that is too classical maybe for this kind, even if it's a very fascinating keyword, but it's too classical for this kind of project. Maybe you have to find another way to nominate it. So you're using this synecdoche in English, I don't know what is the meaning, to generate a landscape using the billboards that is typical of contemporary. and you work very well on that. There is a question of the function and the leisure, the pleasure and the leisure, no? And in the 72 or 3, there was a beautiful exhibition in Triennale di Milano, and the topic was the free time. The question of free time and the leisure has been developed a lot in France and in Italy since the 50 to the 80, because they thought that because now the machine could produce, people could have a lot of free time. So they experimented a new object of spaces, totally detached from morphology and geography and so, and they generate new space in which you are lost, more or less. With specific categories, radical movement experimented. There are 3 master theses done by some author of the radical movement that developed this kind of topic of leisure. How may I generate a space that has no history for a new time that is free, and so. So I suggest you to frame your beautiful and very rich project in these kind of post-critical categories, and to follow this line of research that is quite important, I think, how may I solve the problem of shadow? How may I use a place that is affected from the climate problem without nature? It's quite important because we have you forced to reimagine all the possibility of one element. In this case, the shadow, something that is always in movement, is indirect, not direct. It's not a problem solving idea of design. That is quite important because we are not engineers, so we have to find solution, indirect solution. So I suggest you to follow in the future this kind of line of research, because it's very interesting, and I agree, it's a Neolithic landscape. We don't know if it comes from the future or from the past. It is also quite interesting, the direction of this topic. And congratulations. Brava. Finished.